All right, so maybe we will get started because we have a lot to cover today. So hello and welcome to all who are joining us today from Asia, Australia, South America, Europe, the United States, and Canada. We are grateful for your participation and happy you're able to join us today. I'm Dr. Maria Nardone, Director of Technology and Global Learning at the William Allenson White Institute in New York City. Our topic today is Crush of the Unseen, Engaging Toxic Polarization in Small Groups with Sue Kolod, Tom Hennes, and Mary McRae. Today is the final event of our series as my term as director ends this month. I want to take this opportunity to thank the members of my committee, including Max Belkin, Anton Hart, Karen Gennaro, Tom Hennes, Gurmeet Kanwal, Catherine Nordzi, Vlad Novak, Jean Petrucelli, Hopeton Shaw, Michelle Stevens, David Solomon, and Cleone White. It has been my pleasure and privilege to work with all of you. Thank you. A special thank you also to our administration, including Elizabeth Rodman and John Aumann, for all of their support. Today, we are focusing on a very critical problem in the US and the world, toxic polarization. Toxic polarization is characterized by extreme divisions between political, social, and cultural groups. This polarization is marked by intense animosity, distrust, and an unwillingness to engage in constructive dialogue or compromise. Factors contributing to this deep divide include partisan media, social media echo chambers, and divisive political rhetoric. These dynamics have created an environment where opposing sides view each other as enemies, undermining democratic processes, and making consensus on key issues increasingly difficult. The result is a fragmented society with heightened social tensions and instability. Our speakers today are Dr. Sue Kolod and Mr. Tom Hennes. Dr. Kolod is president-elect of the North American Psychoanalytic Conference. She is supervising and training analyst and member of the faculty of the William Allenson Institute and co-leads a study group on polarization called the Depolarization Project. Dr. Kolod is director at large and serves on the board of directors of the American Psychoanalytic Association. In January 2024, Dr. Kolod was a presenter on a two-part webinar on toxic polarization, hosted by the International Psychoanalytical Association, entitled Behind the Scenes of Toxic Polarization, Consequences of a Divided World, Parts 1 and 2. Mr. Tom Hennes is one of the most sought-after exhibition designers in the world. He is founder of Think Design, an internationally recognized and award-winning exhibition design firm that has presented dynamic visitor experiences at museums and cultural attractions in numerous settings around the globe. Believing in the implicit power of the exhibition medium to engage society in important ways, Mr. Hennes has pursued an ever-deepening involvement with exhibition projects embedded in social and environmental justice. At Think, he has encouraged an evolving conception of relational design, envisioning the exhibition as a narrative environment rich in implicit and explicit confluences, contradictions, and paradox. Mr. Hennes has written extensively on the multifaceted role of museums and has taught at leading academic and design institutions, including the Rhode Island School of Design, the Pratt Institute in Bois-Boucher, France, New York University's Interactive Telecommunications Program, the University of Pretoria, among many others. We're very happy to have our moderator today, Dr. Mary McRae, a counseling psychologist in private practice who does individual and group psychotherapy. She also does coaching and group facilitation to enhance more effective and productive functioning. She is a retired professor of applied psychology, New York University, where she taught for 27 years. Dr. McRae is the president of the William Allenson White Institute, a fellow of the A.K. Rice Institute for the Study of Social Systems, and a member of the New York Center for the Study of Groups, Organizations, and Social Systems. I will turn the program over to Mary now. I just wanted to mention one other housekeeping rule or opportunity to receive questions from the audience. So at any time, please put your questions in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Thank you. Mary, you're still muted.
Okay, thank you. Okay, hello to everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'd like to thank Dr. Maria Nardone for the work that she has done in hosting this series on confronting racism, discrimination, and othering. It is very important for us to have space or spaces to have these kinds of conversations on topics that seem very difficult to talk about. The topic for today, Crush of the Unseen, Engaging Toxic Polarization in Small Groups, was one that it really took me when I first read it. I was, oh my goodness, because the title speaks to the rage, contempt, and hatred that can be held by polarized groups. Toxic polarization is a topic that I think mental health professionals need to not only be aware of, but to consider ways in which we can understand and work with individuals and groups that engage in toxic behaviors. The psychoanalytic concepts of splitting, projection, and projective identification are enacted in groups that are polarized. And I think that we need to be able to look at these behaviors because they lead to extreme behaviors of aggression and violence. And I think in our society and world right now, they are particularly important. So it is my pleasure to present to you two people who come to us with different bios from different settings, yet they speak the same language when it comes to recognizing and engaging in conversations about toxic polarization. I would go on and tell you because I heard them before and I was so taken by their talks that I've been talking to them. So I think that I've joined their team in some way. That's why I'm here as the moderator. But I would like to, the way we're going to do this is Sue is going to talk and then Tom is going to talk and then we're going to all talk, the three of us together. And then we're going to open it up for questions from the participants. So, Sue.
Hi. I think I'm supposed to be spotlighted, correct?
Well, did Maria? Oh, there you go.
Okay, well, I'm going to now screen share. So I want to thank you for inviting us to speak on this important topic. The title of my presentation is The Eruption of Polarization in Small Group Settings. I just want to make sure, is everybody seeing my PowerPoint? Because I'm not seeing anybody on the side here.
No.
What's going on?
We're just seeing you.
You're not seeing my PowerPoint.
No.
Oh dear. Okay. All right, we good?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, all right. Sorry for that. So thank you for inviting us to speak on this important topic. The title of my presentation is The Eruption of Toxic Polarization in Small Groups. I'm going to begin by giving some background information about toxic polarization and 3 examples from small groups, which I either led myself or in which I was a participant. Toxic polarization is defined as a state of intense chronic polarization marked by high levels of loyalty to a person's in-group and contempt or even hate for out-groups. Toxic polarization limits our ability to humanize and engage with political opponents. Toxic polarization is occurring all over the world, both within psychoanalysis and in the world at large, fueled by social media, the pandemic, and authoritarian governments. It's become a defining characteristic of our zeitgeist. In May of 2023, the board of the International Psychoanalytic Association met in Belgrade. We planned to meet with 2 societies to have a cocktail party, but quickly learned that the 2 groups don't speak to one another. So instead, we met with each separately. This kind of unresolved conflict within our field is so prevalent, it has become a defining characteristic of the field of psychoanalysis. We're trained to be good listeners, to be able to hold different and sometimes opposing thoughts in our minds at the same time, to listen to ourselves as we listen to others, to pay attention to our reactions, and to forego judgment. Although our training would suggest that we're uniquely prepared to address polarization and lessen its impact, that's not what we have seen. The rupture that occurred at the American Psychoanalytic Association in March of 2023 is one of the most extreme examples. The conflict was exacerbated by attacks and counterattacks on the APSA listserv, which resulted in the resignation of President Kerry Solkowitz. But October 7th brought polarization within our field to an entirely different level. The rhetoric has become so heated, both within psychoanalysis and in the world at large, that it has even been suggested that the topic should be avoided altogether. In the New York Times, psychologist Dr. Richard Perloff noted that in these situations, a spiral of silence develops in which people with nuanced views on both sides of the issue, perceiving their opinions are in the minority, become reluctant to speak out. What results are simple tropes and cartoonish stereotypes that further polarize the 2 sides. Given the above, I have looked for opportunities to address polarizations in small groups whenever I get the chance. I view these encounters as experiments. There's 3 premises to my experiments. One is that psychoanalysts do have something to offer to alleviate toxic polarization if they can accept the fact that it occurs in everyone, that it is a natural tendency to see how splitting and projection occur in other people or other groups, but to be blind to the fact that the same processes are occurring in oneself. And finally, that group members need to be willing to address the feelings of polarization in themselves. My hypothesis is that if these premises are accepted, there's a good chance the group can contain polarizations so that they don't become toxic. So the 3 I'm going to touch on are the Depolarization Project, an IPA thinking lab that I was involved in, and the recent IPA Group Relations Conference. In 2021, Chris Heath and I decided to initiate a group to study the question of whether psychoanalysis has anything to offer to alleviate toxic polarization. We formed the Depolarization Project, which is a group of 4 psychoanalysts and 4 people who are not in the mental health field, but are very concerned about the spread of toxic polarization within our society. We meet monthly to discuss readings. Sometimes the readings focus on the process of toxic polarization itself, and other times we read papers that have been polarizing within psychoanalysis. Importantly, we also pay attention to how toxic polarization might be occurring within ourselves and within the group. So now I'm going to turn to what I call the enactment. Member A, who's the most radical, has gotten into energetic, and he's also the youngest, has gotten into energetic disagreements with several of us, but especially with member B, who is closer in age to him and holds very different opinions from him. Recently, member A suggested that we read Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth and led a discussion on it. The group decided subsequently that they wanted to read more Fanon and were disappointed when member A did not show up for that meeting. At the most recent meeting, we decided to focus on encampments. After an email exchange with member B, member A angrily quit the group. He didn't opt to come to the group to step down, but wrote several emails explaining why. And I'm going to read just a portion of what he wrote. I have no time for speaking with a fascist who believes I am queer, communist scum who deserves to be shot. Nor do I, on my more sensitive days, have the time for any intentional or unintentional apologism for fascist or proto-fascist actions or individuals from centrists or liberals who willfully or ignorantly lack the insight to know that they are doing so. Ouch. We were all disappointed. Some were angry, especially because he didn't come in and discuss it with us. One member wondered if his stating, "I love capitalism," during the Fanon discussion had been a decisive factor. One member expressed great empathy for member A's rebellion, and another noted that we are all busy people and he might just have felt that it wasn't worth the effort. Was his leaving due to a lack of the group's ability to contain anger and disappointment, or is it just a natural evolution of the group? There is a shared sense of loss among group members and hope we might see it coming next time that there is a disruption. The next example is the IPA Thinking Lab. An IPA Thinking Lab meets 6 times over the course of 3 months to study a particular topic. I was asked to lead one and chose the topic, Understanding Toxic Polarization from the Inside Out. There were 12 psychoanalysts in the group from all over the world. More than half of the group members lived in situations of war and oppression. We found that language issues sometimes made it difficult to engage in discussion. Although everyone in the group speaks English, it was not always clear whether some of the non-native English speakers were understanding everything that was being said. To understand how the process of toxic polarization functions in ourselves, we read a series of articles that have been deeply polarizing, some from psychoanalytic literature and some from other sources. We explored the impact of this literature on ourselves and tried to listen to the reactions of those in the group who may have reacted very differently. I'm going to call this the eruption. In the last 2 meetings, we read a chapter from Psychoanalysis Under Occupation, written by Lara and Stephen Sheehy. One member who was from a country in the Middle East whose English at times was difficult to understand, and members were not always sure he was understanding them, blurted out, "I hate Israel." When asked to elaborate, he repeated some ideas that might be construed as stereotypical anti-Semitic tropes. The discussion that followed could easily have become very polarized, but the group was able to contain his thoughts and feelings, as well as other members' reactions. Not really clear why that was possible in this group. There are a lot of different theories. Some of the members expressed a desire to continue this work after the group ended. My third example is from the IPA Group Relations Conference in Thessaloniki that was held this last May, just last month. This was the first IPA-sponsored group relations conference, and it was also my first group relation experience. I was eager to attend, in part because I wanted to experience how the group relations addresses toxic polarization, as well as exploring my own reactions when polarizations arose. Here are some of my observations as a newcomer. The conference took place in the ancient and picturesque city of Thessaloniki in northern Greece. The hotel where the conference was held was not convenient to the old part of the city, which frustrated me and felt like a tease. It was such a beautiful place that it was, in a sense, off limits. Thessaloniki is convenient to Israel and Europe, and most of the participants came from these places, with 5 of us from the United States. The conference was led by an Israeli analyst, and several of the leaders were from Israel. There were no participants from Latin America or the Asia Pacific. I heard through the IPA grapevine that 40 participants was the hoped-for number, but only 22 people signed up. In many ways, this conference was ideal for exploring toxic polarization. Before the conference even took place, some controversy in the IPA arose about the location of the conference and the fact that many of the leadership were from Israel. In group relations conferences, there is always a focus on authority and leadership, so competition and challenging authority is always present. It was an important learning experience for me to see how I reacted to authority and competition, as well as how I felt about polarizations that emerged in the group. Challenges to authority became present in several ways, and I'm going to mention 2. Perhaps anticipating what was to come, a group of 3 women, one from Israel, one from Paris, and myself, decided to leave the conference for several hours one afternoon and go sightseeing in Thessaloniki rather than participating in one of the subgroup projects. In retrospect, I believe that my wanting to escape the conference may in part have been related to an avoidance of the issues about Israel and Palestine that were brewing. The 3 of us had some trepidation upon return, expecting that we would be punished for our act of freedom. Reactions ranged from none at all to admiration, anger, disapproval, envy, and contempt. I found the envy and contempt the most difficult to bear. When we returned during the systems event, the subgroup, which was focusing on anxiety, invited us to join them, changing the theme to anxiety and freedom. But the biggest challenge to authority, not surprisingly, came up around the strong Israeli presence. Several members, led by a male, non-Jewish participant from the US, who himself holds a leadership position in the IPA, brought up the Israeli-Palestine conflict several times and challenged the leadership explicitly, stating that the leader had occupied the group relations initiative within the IPA. Several of the women participants from Israel accused him of anti-Semitism. I found myself feeling great sympathy for the Israelis, undoubtedly related to my family history, and at the same time in agreement that the group lacked diversity and that this was problematic. This made me feel anxious and helpless. After these eruptions occurred several times over the course of 3 days, one of the group members who hardly spoke said, "This is boring," which ended the polarized discussion, at least for that moment. Some of the members who had become most polarized felt that the group relations conference was helpful in the sense that they were able to put everything on the table in a safe environment and nothing terrible happened. But I was wondering how the leadership of the conference was feeling. It seems that the marriage of psychoanalysis and group relations could be a fruitful area of exploration in addressing toxic polarization, and I intend to take part in future group relations conferences. I'd like to conclude with some observations about what I consider to be the necessary conditions for engaging in small groups for the purpose of studying how polarization becomes toxic. Commitment. In each of the 3 examples, the members made a commitment to hang in there. In the depolarization project, when a member quit, he made it clear that he didn't have the energy or inclination to grapple with a potentially very unpleasant situation. The second one is rhetoric. In the Boston Public Conversation Project, which I often use as a model, 6 women, 3 pro-life and 3 pro-choice, met over 5 years for the purpose of addressing violent acts that had occurred at abortion clinics. In their publications about the experience, they stressed the importance of rhetoric. At the first meeting, ground rules were established: no interrupting, no personal attacks, agreement on language, and remaining open to the other's point of view and history. They found that toning down the rhetoric was critical. The 6 women grappled with clashes over language. How do you refer to what grows and develops in a pregnant woman's womb? Over time, it became apparent that language choice represented the members' most passionately held beliefs and philosophies. For example, that for pro-life women, life itself is more important than the quality of life, which the pro-choice women felt to be the preeminent value. A study done by Robert Pape, professor of political science at the University of Chicago, focused on the rhetoric occurring during the campus protests this last spring, specifically on the phrase, "From the river to the sea, Palestine must be free," a chant often used by pro-Palestinian students, which made some Jewish students feel threatened. So Pape asked the students, when you hear the statement, "From the river to the sea," what do you think? Here are some of his significant findings. 12% of Jewish students and 42% of Muslim students endorsed it means Palestinians and Israelis should live in 2 separate countries side by side. 66% of Jewish students and only 14% of Muslim students endorsed Palestinians should replace Israelis in the territory, even if it means the expulsion or genocide of Israeli Jews. So there was obviously some misunderstanding going on here. The second slide. Secondly, he found that calls for genocide matter widely. Students who interpret "from the river to the sea" to mean the genocide of Jews are 2.4 times more likely to report feeling threatened, even when Jews and Muslims were removed from the analysis. What conclusions can be drawn from this research? What seems obvious to me is that the 2 groups should be talking to each other. The Middle East dialogues that Dartmouth conducted by Tariq El Aris and Suzanne Herschel are relevant here. So what I've learned from the groups I've led and participated in over the last 3 years has left me feeling cautiously optimistic that psychoanalysis does have something to offer in alleviating toxic polarization. The work begins with a commitment to studying one's own tendency in groups to split and project, to stay with the uncomfortable feelings that inevitably arise and approach enactments with curiosity rather than rage and revulsion. Finally, to tone down the rhetoric and try to understand the rhetoric of the others. Things get heated, and it's unrealistic to expect people to be polite all the time when controversial issues come up. But if the commitment is there, polarization need not become toxic. Thank you.
Okay, Tom?
Thank you. I'm going to talk today about a project that I worked on with a team from my firm, the Pulse nightclub shooting, but the memorial, the Pulse Memorial. And I'm going to talk about toxic polarization in that project. I'm in a crowd of people who are survivors and family members of victims of the Pulse nightclub shooting in Orlando. It's the 6th commemoration of the event, and I'm part of the planning team for the memorial that is to be built on the site of the now sealed nightclub. A middle-aged white woman steps onto the stage and begins to speak to the crowd, mostly Black, Brown, and Latinx people. Clearly distraught, she begins with a tearful introduction. Her son and his boyfriend, the son of mixed race and the boyfriend Dominican, were both killed that night. She breaks into sobs, then silently struggles to regain her composure. The crowd is leaning into the space she has created. She begins again, this time with gathering rage. She shouts hoarsely, "A white woman is stealing our tragedy." She's talking about Barbara Poma, the owner of the club and the founder of the Memorial Project. There are affirming noises in the crowd. She continues in an extended, anguished diatribe, saying it was Black and brown people who were killed, Black and brown families who are grieving, and a white woman is stealing their loss, the same white woman who, by owning the club, she holds responsible for the tragedy. More murmurs of support and a few shouts of affirmation from the crowd. The group that's present in the room has turned decidedly anti-One Pulse, the foundation that was formed to create the memorial. The group wants to take its memorial back from those who they believe have taken it from them. What's happening here? Before I go further, I want to say that everything I'm relating here is indeterminate. It's true of every project I work with, but particularly so with Pulse, because I came into it after both the project and the group dynamics were already in play, and moreover, during COVID, via Zoom most of the time. My team included Billy Pivnik, the psychologist who was my fellow traveler on the 9/11 Memorial Museum and opened me to a psychoanalytic perspective and to participation in this institute. The team had a limited view of what was happening within and among its various constituencies, so to an even greater extent than usual, we had to work with limited information, gradually revealed through many modalities over extended periods of time. Not unlike the work of psychoanalysis, perhaps. To give you some visual context, I'm going to just pause for a moment and share a few images from the project. So Pulse was in many ways an ordinary gay club, but it was also extraordinary in that it brought a huge diversity of people together, something that's pretty unusual in that community. And it became a locus of a very important community in Orlando that also extended beyond to a lot of people from around the country. On the night of the shooting and the days after, there were spontaneous memorials around the world. It became a global event was the largest shooting at the time in the United States, and it brought lots and lots of people together, including in Orlando. This was days after. You can see the fence around what was still a crime site. Spontaneous Memorial grew there, and that became a temporary memorial that was built in the months after. The project was to create a permanent memorial on the same site, and somewhat unusually for us, we weren't designing it, we were crafting the narrative. So this is just an image of what the French team's design looked like. It also included what was called the Survivors Walk, which was a 3-block stretch of the path between the nightclub of the night of the shooting and the hospital where the victims were taken. And there was also a museum planned that was going to complement the memorial about several blocks away. And we were involved in that as well. So even though the National Pulse Memorial Project contained a memorial and the Survivors Walk and a museum, I'll be referring to the project today simply as the memorial, in particular because I'm speaking about polarization, not about experiential design. Our task, as I said, was the narrative development for the entirety of the project, but as we moved deeper into the work, we found it repeatedly disrupted by enactments within the groups involved. These were often, I could actually say always, disorienting. At the time, we attributed the upheavals primarily to the profound trauma that had brought this disparate group of people together to begin with. Reflecting back, I think there was more happening here than the working through of unresolved trauma and mourning of the event, as catalytic as these dynamics were, both at the level of the group and the individual. Within and around the meeting I've described, many within the constituent group had lost any feeling of trust in the One Pulse leadership to hold them or to hold the process. From the perspective of group relations theory, this reflects a response to anxiety in which the group unconsciously overthrows its official leadership and authorizes someone else to lead, in this case, the woman in front of the crowd. This archetypal group dynamic, called basic assumption dependency, could also be perceived as feeding into another archetypal group dynamic, basic assumption fight-flight, in which the leadership of One Pulse, not only Barbara, but the entire board and staff, were being collectively attacked for stealing the group's tragedy and its grief, which was hardening in that moment into insurmountable grievance. But I think there was something else going on as well, for which I had neither the frame nor the vocabulary at the time, something I think lay even deeper than the trauma that was thick in the room. To begin to unpack this, I found it helpful to draw upon Christopher Bolas's conception of the transformational object, his formulation of the mothering presence as perceived in earliest infancy. In his book, The Shadow of the Object, he writes, quote, "Not yet fully identified as an other, the mother is experienced as a process of transformation," what he describes as a process of filling up emptiness, of comforting discomfort, of responding or failing to respond to felt needs, and transforming the infant's as yet undifferentiated self from one state to another. Later in life, he theorizes, quote, "The memory of this early object relation manifests itself in the person's search for an object, a person, a place, event, ideology that promises to transform the self." He says, in adult life, to seek the transformational object is to recollect an early object experience, to remember not cognitively, but existentially, through intense affective experience, a relationship which was identified with the cumulative transformational experience of the self, unquote. Bolas describes this form of seeking as, quote, "an endless memorial search for something in the future that resides in the past." I believe, he says, that if we investigate many types of object relating, we will discover that the subject is seeking the transformational object and aspiring to be matched in symbiotic harmony within an aesthetic frame that promises to metamorphose the self, unquote. So what is an actual memorial if not an object that promises transformation, even metamorphosis? In its most direct sense, a memorial is meant to transform loss into something more sustaining, whether it be the capacity to grieve and leave memory behind, secure in the knowledge that it'll be held there, or the transformation of things experienced acutely by those most affected into something that can be felt, acknowledged, worked with, and metabolized by a larger societal collective, in effect, lightening the burdens carried by the few onto the shoulders of the many. The Pulse Memorial Project was being experienced as a group phenomenon by the people in the room, but I believe it was also being used idiosyncratically as a transformational object by its individual participants, both in the room and beyond it. Bolas's conception suggests that this way of using the memorial was a way of seeking transformation of the self in response to personal needs reaching back before and beyond the attack, and yet crystallized by it, tugging at earlier yearnings and traumas, cultural, familial, personal, that got pulled into its wake. For many of the Pulse survivors, these included the struggle to become fully who they were in the midst of family rejections based on their sexuality or gender identity. For others struggling to make ends meet, particularly in the aftermath of the attack, they included seeking some form of redress or redemption. Some parents, unable to accept the identity or lifestyle of their adult children while they had lived, were now experiencing a sense of irredeemably violent separation that demanded repair. Members of the community were thus engaged as a collective group, and at the same time were using the memorial process, as I have come to see it, as an object with a potential for a wide range of profound personal transformations linked to it and also separate from it. Members of the One Pulse Foundation, on the other side, were also seeking a wide range of their own idiosyncratic but collectively redemptive transformations linked to their separate aspirations for the project. Its members were mostly white, mostly wealthy, mostly focused on building something that would draw large numbers of tourists to it, and in fact, the first $10 million raised came from money allocated by Orange County toward tourism development. The board had refused to allow any survivors or family members to join it in spite of strong urgings by myself and others, believing that participation would slow or alter their chosen course of development, turning its focus too much inward, away from the motivations of the tourists they craved. To the woman raging on stage and the crowd increasingly chanting its agreement with her, the board was turning a deaf ear and a blind eye to the needs of the group and, I now believe, to its individual members' potential for transformation as well. Out of the room, the board's positions were hardening. Its members perceived the dissident voices as failing to understand the larger purpose of the memorial as they saw it, and threatening delays or worse. These perceived consequences marked an existential threat to their group and to their individual aspirations. Under increasing pressure and anxiety, the board members who were less confident in the work were falling in behind those who had become more dominant, particularly a pair who held executive positions at a theme park in Orlando. As a group dynamic of basic assumption pairing, in which the group unconsciously relinquishes authority to two people on the assumption that they together will produce the needed solution, swept through the board. Months later, the more senior of the two took over planning for a retreat originally intended for me to work with the board on some of the core splits in the project. Behind closed doors, the board officially deposed Barbara Poma at the retreat and unofficially set aside its chair, effectively, but again unofficially, replacing both of them with a member who had overtaken the weekend. What had started out as a unified group with a unified purpose to build a powerful memorial to the Pulse shooting had split along several fault lines. The first was the purpose itself, whether the project was for those who had directly experienced the trauma of the attack or for those from the outside who would make a touristic pilgrimage to the site. The possibility of it being for both waned as the two sides became mobilized, once against the other. Within each group, there was also a split between those who wanted to bridge and those who were increasingly militant about separating and pushing forward with their respective visions. I think there's another factor central to what was happening as well. It has for some times been my experience that a concrete project like a memorial or a museum operates in parallel with what I've come to call a human project, which activates within its constituencies underlying traumas and unfinished business, things that are not spoken of outside the groups that have experienced them and that remain largely unspoken and unspeakable within the larger group around the project. These become enacted in a variety of ways that are nearly always disruptive, but can be profoundly instructive if attended to and worked with. I've come to associate the idea of a stolen tragedy with what else may have been stolen in the past from the Black and Brown communities represented by the Pulse community, by members of the white community represented in the board. I cannot help wondering whether part of the splitting dynamic was an unconscious refusal, which became conscious once the initial trust between the groups had eroded, to have this memorial stolen as well, that the earlier refusals to participate in many group workshops, which we'd found baffling at the time, were in fact enactments of the fear that the community's labors toward the memorial would be stolen from them by a board and an organization they increasingly perceived as being out of touch with their needs for grieving as a group and out of touch with their needs for transformation as individuals. It's dawned on me only in preparing for this discussion the degree to which this dynamic may also have been linked to the murder of George Floyd just 1 month after we began working with Pulse. At the beginning, there didn't seem to be any overt racial conflict or content within the group around the shooting. Because my team was originally prevented by COVID from engaging directly with the full group, it's also difficult for me to pin a time when a clear racialized split emerged. I now wonder whether an unconscious need was being enacted to fit the larger social narrative that was playing out in front of us into what was missing from the Pulse narrative. I can't help wondering in retrospect whether the lack of participation among the constituents was even more than a refusal to participate in the theft of their own labors. The board itself also maintained only a very tenuous participation as well. Perhaps the unconscious content located in the aftermath of the Pulse shooting and in the social upheaval spurred by George Floyd's murder was too much for either group to take on. Perhaps leaving my team to work out the memorial, museum, and survivors walk on our own was also an enactment of helplessness, itself a group basic assumption dependency that vested us with an unofficial leadership that was also repeatedly overthrown when it provoked anxiety, as it had been prior to the board retreat I mentioned a moment ago. Failures are extremely difficult and painful. They're also more readily instructive than successes. I believe the initial triggers for the toxicity that made this polarization irredeemable were many. They most likely included past racialized trauma that was reignited by the split between the mostly white board and the mostly BIPOC constituents, and the profound disparities of privilege and affluence between the two groups. The lopsided effects of COVID only heightened those disparities at a crucial moment in the project's development, as in our wider culture. Trust, which had been very high in the early days of collective mourning and resolve, when the foundation's name, One Pulse, authentically represented unity, became gradually eroded by refusals on the part of the foundation to allow full representation of the community within it, and by the gradual split between the goal of community healing and the goal of tourism that metamorphosed over time into a fear among both groups that each might steal the project from the other. This feeling was particularly acute among the constituents represented by the woman in the meeting, even while other constituents remained loyal to the foundation. There was intermittent but intense competition within each group for authority to speak on behalf of the respective groups. Absent a mechanism for resolving that issue, fractures appeared early and became wider within each subgroup, further heightening anxieties that I think played into the larger group dynamics. And then there was the refusal of the foundation to listen deeply to the aggrieved groups or to provide a holding environment in which repair could be initiated and continually attended to. The foundation, in effect, abdicated its mothering role and held to an unfeeling, goal-oriented role that became something more akin to abusively paternal. I believe that had those authorities been willing to listen, to create a holding environment, and to respond materially as a transformative object, nurturing at least some of the needs of its constituencies, that the outcome could have been very different. I want to close with a detail that I had at first included and then omitted in earlier drafts of this presentation. It's refused to let go of me, and so it may be of value thinking about toxic polarization in this and other circumstances. Even from the night of the attack, the shooter's present was rarely invoked within this community, and his name was never to be spoken. When I once did speak his name, Omar Mateen, my words caused visible winces and shocked intakes of breath. He had been forcefully and willfully excluded from the narrative, and we came to suspect that under the Foundation's banner, we will not let hate win. The disavowed hatred held by the group was deprived of an object. My belief was and is that the displacement of that hatred, both toward Barbara Poma and after she was removed from the project she had conceived toward opposing factions, fueled the vehemence of the split. I have often wondered, in conversation with the depolarization process that Sue and I are both part of, why hatred seems to be so satisfying in these splits. In this case, it may have been a form of relief at finding an object to receive the projection of what had been disavowed. And I wonder to what degree we might also find projections of what has become disavowed buried deep in the toxic voids between many polarized positions today and in the vehement enactments that riffle even through our own community. What's most suggestive to me about this profoundly toxic polarized split is the mashup of covalent factors that I believe fed upon each other and contributed to the ultimate breakdown of the project. A core trauma forming and seething within the group and its individual participants. The intricacies of group dynamics in the community and throughout the work that are barely containable, if at all, within the project, and within a theoretical frame that can render them comprehensible. The activation of past traumas and unfinished business in a community formed around a concrete project. The toxic cross projections of disavowed material that, if consciously named, threatened annihilation. All of these elements, and probably much more, became flattened into brittle oppositional narratives. I don't know whether these multiple frames can help the next time around, and I can't pretend that they're truly diagnostic. For me, their utility is that they help me navigate the complex terrain of the projects that draw me to them, in the hopes that even those that ultimately fail have contributed materially to those that ultimately succeed. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you both for those wonderful, wonderful presentations. And what struck me is how, Sue approaches it from a psychoanalytic perspective. And Tom comes with it's a psychoanalytic perspective of looking at something that's more concrete and artistic and creative, but both looking at some of the things that create toxic polarization around us. I was so impressed by these talks. So I just want to thank you both for it. For many years, I did a Working with Differences conference series, group relations series at NYU. So the focus for me is very much on looking at groups and what they might represent. And as I listened to Sue, when you talked about the group with member A and member B, well, I was wondering what those two members might have represented for the groups, because one of the things that came to me as I listened to the two of you is that there are these subgroups that, you know, you can have a group, then there are subgroups, and there may be multiple subgroups with different opinions about whatever the topic might be. And those subgroups must represent something for them and for the group as a whole. And with member A and with member B, he got so upset. So I wonder what he might have been holding in terms of projections from the group, and the other person might have been holding in terms of projections for the group. And since both of you were in that group, and maybe both of you could talk about it in terms of what were they holding. And the next thing is in terms of the group, did the group somehow feel that they were projecting anything onto these two members, that they could probably, you know, begin to take their own projections back? Because it seems like those two were so filled with everything, and the members, now this was just my hearing it, but the members seemed like they were really busy trying to contain. So the second thing is, can we contain all of this? And how do we need to contain it, but that container may be to sort of shut it down and make it unspeakable, or let's not talk about it. Or that container might be, okay, what is the issue here? How do we deal with it? So do you have any thoughts, and could you respond to that a little?
Well, as I was listening to Tom and I was thinking about my presentation, I kept thinking about, this is not exactly answering your question, Mary, but it's kind of roundabout. Something I learned in supervision from Edgar Levinson, who was my favorite supervisor at the William Allenson White Institute. And he said, it's not about what you do, it's about what you do after what you already did it. So I don't think these things can be avoided. I think that if you're going to work in this area and try to focus on polarization within groups, it's going to erupt. So the question is, what do you do about it afterwards? And I'm sort of in the middle of trying to figure that out. In this particular situation, I'm not sure what we can do if member A doesn't want to rejoin our group. We talked about reaching out. I think Tom actually said he's going to speak to him. But it already happened, and I'm not sure what we can do at this point. If the person who leaves doesn't want to come back and doesn't want to talk about it.
Well, you know, I'm really asking what that person might have represented for the group, not what you need to do for him or with him, but sometimes that individual, because I always think that the individual is carrying and representing something for the group. And if we could figure out what that is, that helps the group. It helps me when I know, oh, you know, I was really pissed off, but I couldn't feel it. I wasn't showing it. But that person, they showed the anger for me. And maybe that's what that was about. And I couldn't get in touch with my anger because I'm supposed to be a good girl. You know, I mean, that kind of stuff can be very helpful in groups if we think about what they represent.
Yeah, Mary, I from my point of view, I think one, I can't say exactly what each was holding, but I was aware at the time before this happened, but as it was gathering steam, I was aware of leanings that I felt that I didn't express toward the member who left, and in a way against the member who stayed. And these were things that were unverbalized and not entirely unthought, but it was more feeling than thought. And I think that the two of them did come to hold very different feelings that were shared as affinities by different group members in different ways. And the inability to articulate that in the moment, which of course group relations teaches us is something that is helpful, but that inability to be in the moment and be present in the group and be open in the group, I think probably was a contributor to it ultimately needing to be enacted because it couldn't be verbalized. And I think it had to do with exactly what you're talking about. It's a sense of politeness. I can't say that, but it also forecloses the possibility that what we're dealing with is actually a projection, not the actual person in front of us.
Well, to add to what you're saying, Tom, and you brought this up, we were asked to do a write-up of our group for Room, the online publication. And 7 of the 8 of us wrote our experiences in the group, why we were in the group, why we're staying in the group. And they were very laudatory for the most part. And nobody criticized the group. So I think you pointed out that maybe that's what he was holding, the more negative side that no one else expressed.
Well, the other thing that I would like to hear your thoughts about, you brought up the term loyalty. There was some terms of loyalty, dependency, power, hatred. Those are powerful terms that take place in groups. And each of you in your presentations talked about these issues in your groups and more, but I wondered because they kept coming up. So in the work that you've been doing, have you been finding that these are consistent kinds of themes, and have you thought about ways in which you address them on an ongoing basis with groups? It seems like that loyalty, I guess what I'm also referring to here is, after watching the debate the other night and thinking about what's going on in the world in terms of the Republicans and the Democrats, if you, and it's going on in not only here, but in other parts where, you have to be loyal to a group. And that loyalty can lead into so many different kinds of behaviors. So I'm concerned about that loyalty and the aggression that it could bring. So any thoughts about loyalty and aggression?
Yeah, I think for me, one of the things that is almost essential to think about in this kind of situation is the degree to which someone's identifications become fused with the loyalty to the group, and that anything that threatens the group becomes existentially threatening to the individual in return. And I think it's the tightness of that bond that determines, to some degree at least, how sensitive and how reactive somebody is going to be. And I think it's really important to try to work in the situation between this group and individual dynamic wherever we can to understand that bond and understand how tightly coupled a sense of identity is to the group, and try to work both the individual and the group level simultaneously through being sensitive to that and through an acknowledgement of the significance of the group identification.
We, in a number of the groups, the Depolarization Project and also the IPA Thinking Lab, we watched a video about Vamik Volkan, where he talks about chosen trauma, which I find to be a very powerful concept, and how identification with atrocities that occurred affecting a group that you identify with very powerfully, maybe even from hundreds of years ago, come into the present. And I think that's a lot of what's going on with all the polarization around Israel and Palestine. And, I personally have been surprised at my reactions to it, because I'm not really involved with Israel. I haven't been there for years. I was there as 25 years ago. But my mother and my grandmother and my family, my mother's family, were very involved with Zionism. My grandmother was a Zionist, and she was a Hebrew teacher. And it feels, it's like on a visceral level when I hear these chants. And even though, as I showed you with the research, if you deconstruct them, they don't mean what people take them to mean, but it strikes you on such a emotional level. And I think people act out of their emotions without even realizing that.
It's like reactivating old injuries and from generations ago in some ways that
Yes.
Yeah. I want to leave some time for questions from the participants, but one of the ways in which when I was asked to moderate this, I started thinking about toxic polarization and what are the causes. And if you think about it as, I'm working with groups, but there's a cause for this toxic polarization. What is the cause? Do you think about it like a client? This is the cause, and these are the ways, because Sue, you gave a number of different ways in which, you think that we could work with toxic polarization. But is that how you think about it? This is the problem. These are some of the issues that I'm dealing with, and this is how I deal with it. Is that how you approach it?
Well, I approach it that way with the caveat that sometimes they can't be contained. I'm not saying that if you follow A, B, C, D, you can contain them in a group. But just like we say from psychoanalysis, if you could be curious about what's going on rather than angry, well, if you get angry, you get angry, but even anger, to be curious about that rather than having it be distancing. Where it becomes toxic is when you come to the conclusion, I can't talk to those people, or if you talk to those people, you're a traitor, that kind of thing.
Any thoughts before we open it up, Tom?
No, I think it would be great to get to the questions. We've only got about 15 minutes, and it looks like there are lots of questions.
Okay, let's see what those questions are. The ones looking for articles, I'm not going to. Okay, here's one. Diane Gross, as an analyst, third generation American English, only in my family, who was married to a Yugoslav and lived in Belgrade in the past. I saw that. Well, is this a question? Okay. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm trying to go to the ones that are actually questions. I wish we could just listen to statements, but I want to do questions. Here's a question for all of us. Toxic polarization seems an inherently relatable and usable concept, but I'd like to reflect on it further. What makes it toxic? This is from Anton Hart. What makes it toxic, and toxic for whom, we might ask. Sometimes polarization has powerful positive impact on a person or a group of people, enabling the summoning of energetic forces that make seemingly impossible things possible. I'm sorry, Anton, I'm not doing this as well as you would. Could there be, I want to ask, something polarizing, or even toxic about referring to toxic polarization? I'm going to stop there. He has some other, but do y'all want to respond to that?
Well, I think I already defined what I mean when I say it's toxic, when it reaches the point where it feels too dangerous to even engage or speak to the person or the group that's holding a position. But I wanted to refer to something that Tom talked about, and that is the the pleasure that a person or a group can get from identifying with another group and expressing hatred, and how liberating that could feel. So that I'm just kind of associating to what Anton said. Do you have any thoughts, Tom?
Yeah,
I think
it's a really good question and a really good thing to just touch on. With respect to the pulse and also respect to my cat, the polarities that were emerging were treated as noise, but in fact they were signal. They were a signal that the foundation and the organization were not listening to its constituents, and that there was an important divergence that needed to be attended to. In the beginning, it might have been pretty resolvable and quickly resolvable had there been an acknowledgement that this was a signal of something that was developing and something that was important to the aggregate group. The fact that it was continually denied, that it was in effect disavowed by one side, I think then led to it becoming increasingly toxic, because it was a signal that was repeatedly not heard. And so if we can treat polarities often as very useful information and try to work into them to understand what's in the void, then for me, that's an opportunity to actually to engage in repair without having to tip over into toxicity.
Okay, here's another question. Many people are agreeing not discuss the polarizing subject to avoid ruptures. Any thoughts? Should we avoid it or not?
I don't think that works.
Doesn't work.
I mean, if it worked, that would be great. Let's just ignore it.
It seems to me that it's an anxiety reaction that is unhelpful, and the rupture is going to occur, and it's just going to build up pressure and occur worse. So even in work situations where enactments occur, I welcome the enactments, because it's a signal. It's suddenly you can work with it because it couldn't be verbalized. It becomes enacted, and you can move into it and do something with it.
Well, here is a really interesting one. Are you thinking about the death instinct in relation to toxic polarity?
This has come up before. People have mentioned the death instinct. I can't say that I really think about it that way. Maybe because it seems more about survival than about annihilation to the people who are experiencing it.
And here's one from Lawrence Balter. Have you seen any actual changes in perspectives and questions, in perspectives and positions by individuals in the groups that met for years about women's rights to decide whether to terminate a pregnancy? Any shifts? And if so, what are they?
Well, I didn't have time to go into that whole project, but nobody changed their mind, not surprisingly. And I think that's one of the things that Tom and I and the groups that we've been involved with, we don't try to change anybody's mind. That's not the point. But what did happen is the group members developed tremendous respect for one another and for each other's positions, and felt very protective of each other. And that felt like a huge movement forward.
I think importantly, and I've seen this in many different circumstances, beginning with the 9/11 Museum, actually even before that, working in South Africa, there's a difference between disagreeing and making the assumption that the other is representing a position from an inhuman perspective. representing that are understanding or coming to believe that the other is operating from a different but equally human perspective is, I think, an essential part of the work. I think that's the change we're really looking for. And whether opinions change in the process is almost irrelevant compared to whether we're able to hold each other's humanity in the conflict.
Okay, here's one from Helen Quinones. I join you in the vision of using psychoanalysis to help us understand the complex processes that are in play in polarized situations. As I listen, I think we need to veer away from such known dynamics as projective identification. We need to be open to such factors as how the structure already established is colonizing the other, authoritarian and exploitative, taking over what is so cherished by the community. Language we use is also important. Containment may sound like repression or of another idea, especially if you are not familiar with psychoanalysis. Yeah, that issue of containment I was going to ask you about. So any thoughts about Helen's question?
I didn't understand her question, but maybe you could pose your question about containment, Mary.
Well, I think that we talk about containment in groups a lot because the group is supposed to be, I used to say a safe container, but it's never safe, but it's supposed to be a safe enough container for people to express their views. So in a toxic polarization place, is it really trying to contain all the anger and the aggression, or is it really creating a safe enough place, a space for people to give voice to some feelings that might be difficult and even unspeakable because, it's hard to speak about this thing. So is containment the right word? I guess. Is that what we're trying to do?
I think of it more as holding, but Sue, while you're thinking about this, I just want to say that I think the question is actually a really, really useful way of trying to tease out what is structural and what is personal, or what is structural and what belongs to shifting group dynamics. That the structural being the kind of air that we're breathing, the preconditions that we come into that carry with them in assumptions, unthought knowns, if you will, that position our responses in different ways without conscious, or you could even say personal motivation, but then become manifest through those things that we are, in a sense, speaking out of a structural perspective. My whiteness, my maleness is setting up a precondition for my approach to things, or the way I'm perceived in addressing things, that is simply there. And what I do with that, or what a group does with whatever structural preconditions there are, seem to me to be very motile, very dynamic, very complex. But it's important to recognize that there are certain foundations that are in place that we didn't create, but we are absolutely a part of.
Now, maybe you understood this better than I did. I thought Helen was talking about the structure of psychoanalysis itself. I mean, is that the way you took the question? Or Mary, is that the way you understood it?
Well, I don't know, but I was already moving on to the next one because I was trying, so forgive me, because I'm looking at the time and I wanted to ask just one more question before I get back to Maria. Do I have time to do that, Maria?
Yes.
Okay, so this one is from Nina Traylor. How do you think our current communication and conflict resolution strategies contribute to or exacerbate toxic polarity within our group, and what changes can we make to improve this?
Well, that's a huge question. I'm going to give a short answer and give Tom a minute. The one thing I have been convinced of is that people have to buy in. They have to be willing to put themselves in a situation where they're going to feel all kinds of feelings they don't want to feel, and to make a commitment to stay with that. So that's my answer to that one, the short answer.
And I think it's very important to examine and to encourage members to examine the varied identifications they're bringing into a conflict, and varied identifications they're bringing into their own position, to recognize that many of these may be in conflict, and many of them may be activated by the situation in ways that are, very alive and also very unconscious, and shaping or missshaping the structure of the discourse.
It seems like the group relations structure and approach might be well suited to dealing with those kinds of things.
Well, thank you for that, Sue. I appreciate that coming from you, because I do think that group relations conferences may be a place where we could deal with some of these toxic, polarized topics and feelings. And we have to think about that a little bit more. So thank you for that.
I want to thank the three of you, Tom, Mary, and Sue, for your very thought-provoking, rich presentations today. There's so many questions that clearly we should probably have some more conferences on this. Or I'm hoping that maybe the people who are asking the questions will join some of the groups' opportunities to take this further. I also wanted to underline, as we get engaged in polarizations and hatreds flare, that we'll remember, one of the things you underlined, Tom, which is the difficulty in maintaining seeing the other person as human, and keeping hold of that humanity. So if we can all, keep hold of the other person's humanity in the conflict, I think that's something that can anchor us and hopefully have a more positive outcome. I did want to also mention there were some questions about slides, if they would be available to the participant, to the attendees today. And there were also some questions about articles. I do have them, so I'll ask Sue about her articles, and Tom about the reference for Bolas's book, and if possible, have Elizabeth Rodman send that information to all the attendees today. And one other thing, in case you missed any of our events, including this one, they will be available on the Institute's YouTube channel. So feel free to see them. And I thank you all for being here today, and wish you all a very happy Saturday and a good weekend. So thank you so much. Bye-bye.
And thank you, Maria, for all of your work on this.
Yes, thank you. This is a series, a wonderful series. Thank you so much for it.
Okay, bye.